Chapter 18. Brian Gets the Blame. Ida woke up the next morning cosy under a brightly coloured patchwork quilt. She blinked in the dappled light filtering through the ivy-covered window in the bedroom. Just one huge bed, really. It took a minute for her to remember that she'd gone to bed in an old, overgrown railway carriage with a gang of thieving girls. She opened her eyes wide with an awful thought. What if they'd gone back home? They knew where she lived, didn't they? And they were emptying the house of everything the bailiffs had left while she was lying there in bed. But they'd only been kind to her, though the sack of pickings brought back late last night by the grumpy one called Fingers made her feel very uncomfortable indeed. Then she remembered what she'd told them about Dad. She hadn't told that to anyone ever. The smell of bacon was in the air and her belly rumbled. Gin, the big girl who had rescued her from the horrible Mrs. Buller, was still fast asleep, with clothes and blankets strewn all about her in little nests that the other three girls had left. It was a bit chilly round Ida's shoulders without the quilt. She wasn't in her mac any more either. She spotted it in a heap by her feet. She peered through the doorway into the sitting room and felt a blast of heat on her face from the stove. In the kitchen end of the room, at the round table, Brian was sorting her machine parts again, holding each one in the light from the lamp. She looked up and smiled kindly at Ida. "Hello," she said. Ida felt ashamed that she'd slept so well when Bonnie was stuck in the orphanage. She wanted to say, "I'd better be going then. Thank you for having me." But she also wanted a closer look at Brian's machine. Maybe Ida would recognise it. An alternator, perhaps, or a dynamo. She remembered Mum's shopping bag with Mr. Rogers' hacksaw, screwdriver and spanner inside, and noticed it was still by the table where she'd left it. Ida got up from the mattress and sat down at the table with Brian. "Do you know what it is?" "My dad told me it was like a clock." Brian showed her the curled-up wad of paper covered in tiny handwriting. "These are his instructions." "Can I look?" asked Ida. The pages were thin and crackly with writing. Ida carefully peeled away the first sheet. The second was covered in drawings of all the different parts. Ida could match some of the larger shapes, but you had to look at them the right way, and that was difficult to see. What Ida could see was that it needed a spanner and some more nuts and bolts. "Would you like a bacon bun?" asked Brian. "I can make it for you. You don't have to go." Ida was hungry, in spite of the corned beef sandwiches last evening. "Yes, please," she said. Brian gave her 3 thick slices of bacon in one of Mrs. Jupp's floury bread rolls with a cup of tea. Ida couldn't wait. She took a big bite and as she chewed, watched Brian turn a machine part this way and that, comparing it with the sheet. She did feel a little uncomfortable that the roll had definitely been stolen from Mrs. Jupp, but she decided not to think about that too much, nor where the bacon had come from. Getting up made Ida realise she really needed the toilet and couldn't hold on any longer. Where's the lav?" Brian pointed to the door that said WC. It was a relief to go, but Ida wondered how all of this was here. Toilet, stove, wash basin, it had everything and was so well hidden. How long had it been here? Did anyone know? She washed her hands at the sink and dried them on a towel hung on a line over the stove, where a new log was crackling. She looked around again for the sack of pickings, but she couldn't see any sign of it. There was no sign of those 2 girls either, Grumpy Fingers, or Baby, who was kind, but still a thief like the other one. Had her mother never bothered to think of a name for her? Had she even had a mother? "Are the others out?" she asked. "Yes," said Brian. "Didn't you want to go out?" "I mostly stay here, where it's safe for me, and I had to make you breakfast." Brian put the hot bacon pan in the sink with a hiss of steam. "What about Aunt Constance. I mean, Lady... No, Gin. She hasn't woken up yet. No, not yet. Brian glanced at the door to the room of mattresses. Ida really wanted to check if she was all right, but told herself to stop being silly. Brian, on the other hand, was back to frowning over two machine parts she was trying to fit together. Ida took the hacksaw, screwdriver and spanner out of Mum's shopping bag and put them on the table. Will these help? Brian picked up the spanner, but even adjusted, it was far too big for the nuts and bolts she had. I think it needs a smaller spanner or a set of spanners. Don't you? Said Ida. Brian nodded and gave the spanner back. Poor Brian. She was trying so hard to do something for her dad. Ida knew what that felt like and realised that she could help. Would you like to borrow some spanners? The girl's eyes sparkled. Yes, please. I love spanners. You could come to my house and we'll fetch them. Brian's forehead wrinkled in thought. She nodded. Yes, I'd like to see your house. I haven't been in one for a long time. Shall we go now? Said Ida, before Gin wakes up. Brian ran to the mattress room and came out pulling on a huge, thick jumper. She wasn't a small girl like Baby and Fingers, but she still had to roll up the sleeves to make it fit. She wore trousers. Ida would have loved to wear trousers, but Mum always liked her and Bonnie in dresses. It's what girls wear, she used to say. Ida would have liked a world where they could wear what they liked. Brian took a cap out of her trouser pocket. She pulled it low over her face and tucked her hair inside. My dad's. I like hats too. Ida fetched her Mac and Miss Lovelock's mum's shawl off the huge bed and followed Brian out of the Lily. Ida was quite lost as to where the tunnel to the station might be. It looked like there was no way out at all. But it didn't take Brian long to find one. Daylight shone between the tangle of bare branches as they both were bent low to go through. Was it the same one? Ida wasn't sure. It wasn't. Instead of the tunnel leading to the coal heap, Ida was amazed to find herself in the allotments at the end of Camellia Lane. She followed Brian round the patches of bare earth, frozen hard in ridges, and not a single gardener to be seen. At the other side, where the fence separated the allotments from the road, Brian pushed open the gate. You live at number 7, don't you? How do you know? I listen. Brian strode along Camellia Lane from the 100-and-somethings to the 70s, the 50s and the 30s. She strode past the end of Dahlia Road, Ida's usual shortcut to that end of West Street. Not that she had cause to go there often, and stopped right outside number 7. We'll have to go in through the backyard, said Ida. Round the back, the gate onto the alley was still on the latch. Most people didn't bother locking up at the back, not even bailiffs. Brian followed Ida into the kitchen, took off her cap and shook her hair out, and put the cap on the table, although it was freezing cold in the house. She started opening the cupboard doors. Ida kept her school Mac on, and Miss Lovelock's mum's shawl wrapped round her neck. What are you looking for? Ingredients, said Brian. Ida drew back the curtain that hid Mr. Rogers' toolbox under the draining board. The kit rings rattled along the rail. Here are the tools. Ida put the toolbox on the table. Your cupboards are almost empty, Brian said sadly, and sat heavily on Bonnie's chair. But Brian's eyes lit up at the box. She pulled out a small spanner, a smaller spanner, and a tiny screwdriver. My dad had tools like this, but they took them away, so he couldn't make any more of a nuisance of himself. Ida sat down too and wondered if she'd done the right thing. Did Brian understand it was only lending? Mum was always saying, hold your horses, Ida, stop and think for a minute. Too late now. The girl was enjoying herself far too much. It would be horrible to disappoint her. When Brian had chosen, she lined the tools up on the table. It reminded Ida of how they lined up on the wall in Mr. Rogers' garage. A noise came from upstairs. They both heard it, the scrape of drawers being opened and slammed shut, then the creaks of footsteps across the ceiling. Ida froze. Brian anxiously scooped up the tools and dropped them in her trouser pocket. Ida put her finger to her lips and pointed upwards. She was sure her heart banging could be heard at the end of the street. Someone was creeping about upstairs. Ida picked up Mum's wooden rolling pin off the draining board. A door slammed against the wall. She heard a sprinkle of plaster and the screech of a window being pushed open. Her heart beating like a prisoner, rattling the bars, she pulled back the curtain at the bottom of the staircase. A cold blast of air rushed down into the kitchen. "They're getting away out the back!" Indignation launched Ida up the stairs, 3 steps at a time, waving the rolling pin like a club. Brian followed, shouting, "Stop! Thief!" which, if Ida had had a moment to think about, she'd have thought it a bit rich coming from Brian. At the top of the stairs, Mum's front bedroom door wasn't quite shut, but Ida and Bonnie's door was still swinging from its slam against the wall. A lump of plaster and a sprinkling of dust and bits covered the floor, and the curtains billowed at the open bedroom window. Ida dashed to the sill, but there was no sign of the burglar in the alley. She leaned out the window and wanted to hurl the rolling pin after them. She couldn't believe that any of her neighbours would burgle. They were all so kind. Who else would know about the bailiffs? But then she remembered seeing a shadow that could have been a person hiding in number 10's porch on the day Mum died. Who would be so evil to do that? What were they after? Brian stood in the doorway. All her excitement for the tools had drained away. Ida's fist curled tight round the wobbly rolling pin handle. "I don't know." A moan came from the other bedroom. Ida's heart sank to her boots. She dropped the rolling pin. Someone was still here. She could barely speak, but Brian heard it too, and they both stared at Mum's door. Ida took a deep breath, clenched her fist, crept the 2 steps across the tiny landing, and nudged Mum's door open. With Brian behind her, she peered inside. There, sticking out from underneath the end of her and Bonnie's bed, she saw a leg, a shiny black shoe, a black sock, and a black trouser leg with a sharp crease. A voice creaked. "Ida!" Ida pushed the door fully open. "Uncle Arthur, what happened?" "Oh, Ida, I came round to put a bit more coal in the bunker. I didn't know about the bailiffs. Heard noises. I didn't get them." Uncle Arthur gripped the edge of the bed and sat up. "Did they hit you?" "Clonked me with the bed knob." Uncle Arthur rubbed his head and indicated the bed knob sitting in its own dent on the counterpane, surrounded by all Mum's papers. Like an arrow in her heart, Ida remembered Mum's rings. Why had she put them in there? Everyone had beds like that, didn't they? So anyone would know what a good or terrible hiding place it was. "What's the matter?" asked Uncle Arthur. "Mum's rings. They've taken Mum's rings." "Oh, I'm so sorry, my dear. I expect they're gone." Uncle Arthur stood up. He was so tall, his head nearly touched the ceiling. "I've got a feeling I know who it was, but I won't voice my suspicions yet. Just to say, if I were Herbert Knipe, I'd start looking for a new apprentice pronto." Uncle Arthur raised his eyebrows and looked over Ida's shoulder. Ida felt Brian's breath on the back of her neck. This is my friend from school. Her name's Brenda," said Brian. "Yes, Brenda," agreed Ida. Uncle Arthur looked Brenda up and down. She did look a bit odd, and Ida felt a little embarrassed for her. But Uncle Arthur smiled. "Do I know your father?" "He's a scientist," said Brian proudly. "That's very interesting. Where does he live?" "He doesn't live there anymore. My friends do." He must have found it difficult to find peace and quiet so close to the station. No, he liked it. Well, Ida, I must be getting back to the shop. Old Mr. Bone passed over this morning. As you'll be moving on soon, we can leave the landlord to sort out the damage to the window, and don't call the police just yet. Let's give the boy a chance. Uncle Arthur picked up his hat off the bed, a sober black bowler like the Prime Minister Mr. Baldwin had. But your head, will you be all right? Just a bruise, I expect. Uncle Arthur touched his bowler as he left. His steps faded, and with the click of the front door latch, he was on his way back to Underwood and Son. How could she have been so stupid to hide Mum's wedding ring and engagement ring in the bed knob? Mum took them off months ago and told Ida where they were for when, but Ida wouldn't let Mum say when. And now when had happened, and they were gone. Alf. Had it really been Alf, like Uncle Arthur said? They'd been rivals ever since school. How could he have gone this far? Ida should get the police, but Uncle Arthur had said not to. Oh, she hated thieves with all her heart. And what was she doing here with one? Brian? Brenda? Whatever her name was, with her pockets full of Mr. Rogers's tools, was just another thief in a gang of thieves. And here she was, breathing the same air as one. Ida Barnes, you are a stupid girl. I'm sorry, Ida. Brian offered a hand as if she was going to pat her. There. Ida shrugged it off. This weird girl in her boy's clothes touching her. Go away! The girl was still there. Ida pushed her away. I don't want to join your daft gang. I'm not a thief. I don't steal from people like you do. Go away. I'll get Bonnie on my own. Brian stood there like a sack of potatoes. But your uncle... Don't talk about Uncle Arthur. He's trying to help. Give the tools back to Mr. Rogers when you've finished and tell Baby to stop bothering me with silly notes. I can do it myself. She sat down on the bed amongst the muddle of Mum's leftover things. She closed her eyes and concentrated on her breathing. Ida Barnes was going to shut Brian and all of those thieving girls and boys out. Brian ran down the stairs. Ida heard the clunk of tools falling on the kitchen floor. She heard the back door open, the back gate slam shut, and Brian's boots running away. Ida flung herself across the paper-strewn counterpane and sobbed. She just couldn't be strong any more.